You sit alone in a quiet room. No noise, no demands, no expectations. Yet something heavy presses against your mind, an unease you cannot name. It feels as if you're being pulled by invisible threads, threads you never agreed to wear. This is the strange paradox of modern life. Even when nothing is happening, the mind refuses to be still. It leaps into fantasies of what you should be doing, worries about what might go wrong, cravings for what you don't yet have, and guilt about everything you're not. Most people call this being human. Schopenhauer called it being imprisoned. Not by governments, not by society, but something far more intimate: desire. Every desire, he said, is a chain. The moment you want something, a person, a dream, an image of who you think you should become, you hand over a piece of yourself. You start negotiating with reality, bargaining with the future, worrying about outcomes you cannot control. If you don't get what you want, you suffer. If you finally achieve it, you suffer again, this time from the fear of losing it. And so the cycle continues: craving, chasing, achieving, fearing, losing, craving again. The world keeps moving, and you keep running, pulled by strings that tighten a little more each day. Yet here is the part we almost never consider. What if the prison was never external? What if the discomfort you feel in the silence of your own room isn't because something is wrong out there, but because something is unsettled in here? Schopenhauer believed that the greatest illusion of life is the belief that freedom comes from satisfying desires. We think that once we get the job, the partner, the wealth, the recognition, then we'll finally rest. Then we'll finally be free. But freedom never appears, because the moment one desire is fulfilled, another quietly replaces it. So the real question is not how to fulfill your desires. The real question is, what happens when you stop letting desire pull the strings? What happens when you refuse to play the game? Schopenhauer's answer was radical and unsettling. You don't become empty. You become free. And once you see the chains for what they are, something irreversible begins, a shift that forever changes how you relate to people, ambitions, and the world itself. Schopenhauer believed there is a force beneath everything we do, something deeper than logic, deeper than personality, even deeper than our conscious intentions. He called this force the will. Not willpower, not determination, but an ancient, blind, irrational impulse that lives inside every living being. According to him, the world is not primarily shaped by reason or morality, but by this restless, insatiable will that demands more, and more. You feel it every time you want something: a better career, a partner who finally understands you, a future where life is easier, clearer, more fulfilling. You feel it when you imagine a different version of yourself, a better version, a more admired version. The will whispers that fulfillment is just one achievement away, just one victory, one milestone, one transformation. But as soon as you reach it, the satisfaction slips away like water through your fingers. This, Schopenhauer argued, is the tragedy of human existence. Every desire creates tension. Every pursuit creates restlessness. Every achievement is short-lived. And once the excitement fades, the mind immediately searches for the next thing to chase. The will doesn't care if you're exhausted, anxious, or broken. It only wants to keep moving. This is why people find themselves trapped in cycles of ambition, comparison, and disappointment. The desire for career success turns into obsession. The desire for love becomes dependency. The desire for approval transforms into insecurity. Even the desire for a better life becomes a source of endless dissatisfaction, because the fantasy of perfection will always outrun reality. Schopenhauer saw desire as the root of jealousy, rivalry, and the silent hatred we feel toward people who have what we lack. It is the breeding ground of anxiety and self-doubt, making us believe our worth is conditional, fragile, and dependent on circumstances we cannot fully control. And as long as desire rules us, other people will rule us too. The world can manipulate you simply by promising what your will already hungers for. Yet here lies the contrast that makes Schopenhauer feel almost prophetic today. Modern society teaches the opposite. Capitalism is built on the idea that desire is good, ambition is strength, and productivity is identity. The social media sells the illusion that happiness is something you can curate, purchase, or achieve with enough effort. The myth of self-improvement tells you that you're always one upgrade away from peace. Schopenhauer tears this illusion apart. He warns that as long as the will drives your life, you will always feel incomplete, always reaching, never arriving. And in understanding this dark truth, you begin to see the world and yourself with unsettling clarity.
Human beings like to believe they are independent thinkers, rational, self-directed, immune to manipulation. But Schopenhauer's philosophy forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Whoever understands what you desire also understands how to control you. The will that drives you from within becomes a map for others to navigate, exploit, and steer. It begins subtly. An employer learns that you fear losing your job. Suddenly, deadlines tighten, expectations rise, and you find yourself sacrificing sleep, dignity, and peace to protect the salary that keeps you afloat. You call it responsibility, but beneath it is fear, fear shaped by desire, the desire for financial security, the desire to maintain a lifestyle, the desire not to fall behind. Your boss doesn't need to threaten you. Your own desires do the threatening for him. The same dynamic appears in relationships. A partner who senses your hunger for their approval can withhold affection just enough to keep you chasing it. A friend who knows you crave validation can offer praise like a rationed drug, giving it when they want you closer, withdrawing it when they want control. Even families use desire as leverage, often unintentionally, tying love to obedience, worth to achievement, and loyalty to sacrifice. You become trapped not by force, but by the fear of losing what you desire most. Societies have perfected this art on a massive scale. Governments promise stability, identity, and safety, and in return, they ask for compliance. Corporations promise status, beauty, efficiency, and in return, they demand your attention, your time, your privacy. Influencers promise belonging and admiration, and in return, they harvest your desires like a resource. Marketers study your cravings more carefully than you study yourself. They know what you click, what you fear, what you envy, what you hope for at 3 a.m. They know your desires, and therefore, they know your weaknesses. Schopenhauer's insight becomes terrifyingly clear. The more you want, the easier you are to control. Desire becomes leverage. It becomes soft coercion. You aren't forced into submission. You volunteer for it. We willingly trade our autonomy for the promise of fulfillment. We surrender our peace to protect an image. We reshape our lives around the cravings that others know how to trigger. Every desire becomes a chain, and every person who understands that chain gains a key to your emotions, your decisions, your identity. This is why the world doesn't need to control you directly. It only needs to guide your desires, and you will control yourself on its behalf. This leads to a final unsettling question, one that Schopenhauer believed could shatter the illusion of external power. If your desires make you vulnerable, what would your life look like without them? Human beings are wired to believe that the next achievement, the next relationship, the next possession, the next milestone will finally deliver lasting satisfaction. But modern psychology reveals a phenomenon that mirrors Schopenhauer's bleak insight, the hedonic treadmill. It is the observation that no matter what we obtain, no matter how much pleasure or relief it brings, the mind quickly returns to its baseline. What once felt miraculous becomes mundane. What once felt rare becomes routine, and the wheel of desire begins turning again. A person who suddenly becomes popular discovers this harsh truth first. The attention feels electrifying at first, like a long-awaited validation. But within weeks, the thrill fades. What once felt like a triumph now feels like a fragile status that must be defended. Every like, every comment, every compliment becomes a measurement of worth. The fear of irrelevance replaces the joy of recognition. That person is no longer chasing fame. They are fleeing the terror of losing it. The same cycle repeats in material life. You buy a new phone, and for a moment the world feels sharper, faster, more complete. But soon the novelty dissolves. The object becomes invisible through familiarity. Now you want the next model, the next upgrade, the next spark of excitement. The treadmill accelerates and you keep running, believing the problem is that you simply haven't reached far enough. Even in love, a place where humans hope to escape the turmoil of desire, the cycle persists. The beginning is intoxicating, filled with wonder and certainty. But slowly fear creeps in. Fear of loss, fear of abandonment, fear that the person you cherish might drift away. Love becomes tangled with anxiety, and the desire to protect it creates new forms of suffering. The mind cannot rest because everything it values becomes something it might lose. Schopenhauer saw this not as a psychological flaw, but as the fundamental tragedy of existence. Desire creates motion, and motion creates torment. The moment you believe something can complete you, it gains the power to unsettle you. The moment you attach your peace to an outcome, that outcome becomes your master.
This is the cruel irony. We chase things because we think they will free us from emptiness, but the chase itself deepens the emptiness. We accumulate more, expect more, demand more, and yet feel increasingly hollow. The hedonic treadmill keeps moving, and we run faster, believing we're progressing, when in truth, we're circling the same loop of want and disappointment. The more we seek completion outside ourselves, the further it retreats. There comes a moment, quiet, subtle, and almost imperceptible, when a person begins to realize that the world has far less power over them than they once believed. It doesn't happen through achievement or success, it happens through releasing the grip of desire. Schopenhauer believed that when the endless hunger inside us begins to weaken, something unexpected appears in its place, a strange, radiant form of inner peace. The mind, once pulled in 1,000 directions, begins to settle. The constant noise, the comparisons, the cravings, the pressure to prove something slowly fade. There is no dramatic revelation, no sudden transformation. Instead, there is a soft unraveling, as if a burden we didn't know we were carrying finally drops from our shoulders. The world feels lighter, not because it has changed, but because the chains that bound us to its expectations have loosened.
This shift creates what can only be described as an inner fortress. When you no longer crave someone's approval, their disapproval cannot wound you. When you stop measuring yourself through society's eyes, the judgments of others lose their sting. When you stop believing that your worth is tied to status, ambition, or acquisition, the system that once manipulated you begins to crumble. You become ungovernable in the most profound psychological sense, not rebellious, not hostile, but unreachable by the forces that once controlled your emotions. And for the first time, suffering begins to lose its sharpness. Pain remains, challenges remain, but they stop defining you. Without obsessive desire, disappointment loosens its grip. Without attachment to outcomes, fear loosens its grip. The inner world becomes a space where clarity grows, not from indifference, but from understanding. This is not nihilism. It is not the cold withdrawal of someone who has given up on life. It is the clarity of someone who has finally stepped outside the illusions that once ruled them. The world does not disappear. Emotions do not vanish overnight. Ambitions do not dissolve overnight, but they stop being prisons. They stop being compulsions. They become choices, quiet, deliberate, and free from desperation. What emerges is a version of yourself that feels grounded, untouchable, and startlingly independent. A self that does not need to chase, beg, impress, or prove. A self that is no longer dragged by the currents of desire, but moves with a calm and deliberate purpose. This is the turning point, the moment you realize freedom was never found in acquiring more. It began the instant you stopped needing more. There is a kind of power that rarely appears in motivational speeches or self-help books. It is ancient, quiet, and profoundly misunderstood. Schopenhauer called it the highest form of human strength, the ability to renounce unnecessary desire. Not to withdraw from life, not to live in isolation or denial, but to loosen the grip of cravings that keep us psychologically enslaved. Throughout history, the strongest individuals were not the ones who accumulated the most, but the ones who needed the least. Monks who walked away from wealth and status, Stoics who trained their minds to remain calm in the face of chaos, artists who rejected fame to protect the purity of their work, philosophers who lived simply so that their thoughts could remain uncorrupted. They understood a fundamental truth. When you stop clinging to external rewards, the world loses its leverage over you. Renunciation in this sense is not deprivation, it is psychological independence. When you desire less, you fear less. Fear of loss fades, fear of judgment dissolves. Fear of not keeping up with others no longer dictates your choices. And in that silence, you begin to experience a kind of autonomy that modern society never acknowledges. No one can pressure you with what you do not crave. No one can manipulate you with rewards you no longer seek. This is the essence of existential freedom, a mind that cannot be coerced because it is no longer shackled to constant wanting. Contrast this with the modern world, where desire is treated like a virtue. The economy grows by convincing you that you are incomplete. Social media thrives by amplifying your insecurities. Consumer culture depends on your craving for more recognition, more status, more validation. You are told that ambition is courage, that restlessness is normal, that dissatisfaction is a sign of progress. But beneath this noise lies the truth Schopenhauer exposed. Desire is the easiest way to control a human being. When you detach from these expectations, the spell breaks. Relationships evolve when you are no longer desperate for reassurance. Career choices become clearer when you are not chasing prestige. Finances become more stable when you stop buying symbols of identity. Even your sense of self becomes stronger when you are no longer defined by what you want, but by what you can walk away from.
Renunciation does not shrink your life, it deepens it. It strips away the illusions that promised happiness but delivered only anxiety. It reveals that freedom is not about having everything, it is about being free from needing everything. And in that state, you finally experience what Schopenhauer believed to be the rarest achievement, a mind that belongs entirely to itself. Freedom is one of those ideas that everyone claims to understand, yet almost no one sees clearly. In modern culture, freedom is advertised as the ability to do whatever you want, buy whatever you desire, chase every feeling, indulge every impulse. But Schopenhauer saw a danger buried inside that definition. He believed that the moment your desires control you, even the noble ones, you stop being free. Not because desire is bad, but because it quietly becomes the puppeteer behind your thoughts, your emotions, and your identity. His philosophy is often misunderstood as a call to emotional numbness, a rejection of love, ambition, or the joy of living. But that was never the point. He wasn't asking people to suppress their humanity. He was asking them to reclaim it, to stop letting their inner world be dictated by cravings strong enough to bend their backbone, pull their strings, and fracture their peace. Freedom, to Schopenhauer, was not about renouncing life. It was about renouncing the tyranny of compulsion. It meant being able to love without clinging, to hope without collapsing, to act without being owned by the outcome. You can chase success, but if you fear failure so deeply that it shapes your every decision, then success isn't your goal, it's your master. You can love someone deeply, but if their approval becomes the oxygen you breathe, then love isn't the bond, it's the chain. You can dream boldly, but if the dream becomes the only version of yourself you can accept, then the dream stops being a path and starts being a prison. Schopenhauer's idea of freedom is the middle path that modern culture rarely teaches. Not the cold emptiness of extreme asceticism, not the restless hunger of endless desire, but a state where you choose your desires like a craftsman chooses his tools, carefully, intentionally, without letting any one of them define who you are. It's the freedom of someone who works with passion, yet sleeps peacefully even on the nights when nothing goes right. The freedom of someone who can walk away from a toxic relationship not because they feel nothing, but because they value themselves more than the comfort of attachment. The freedom of someone who pursues greatness not out of insecurity, but out of curiosity, creativity, and love for the craft. In this sense, Schopenhauer wasn't teaching detachment from life. He was teaching mastery over the forces within us that quietly shape life. Real freedom is not the absence of desire. It is the absence of enslavement by desire. There comes a moment in every person's life when they realize that most of their suffering didn't come from the world itself, but what they demanded of it, the expectations they carried, the validation they chased, the fears they protected, the desires that whispered again and again that happiness was always one step away if only they obtained just a little more. And it is in that moment of recognition that the first spark of freedom begins. Schopenhauer believed that true sovereignty is psychological, not material. It is not the freedom of wealth, status, or influence. It is the freedom of needing less from the world around you. The freedom of no longer being held hostage by outcomes, opinions, or the unpredictable tides of circumstance. When you stop being driven by desire, something remarkable happens. People can no longer manipulate you. They cannot weaponize your insecurities. They cannot shape your identity. Your emotional world stops being a battlefield controlled by external forces and becomes a territory ruled from within. This is the quiet revolution that happens when desire loosens its grip. You stop negotiating your worth with others. You stop compromising your inner peace for temporary approval. You stop mistaking possession for fulfillment. And suddenly, the world's ability to injure you begins to fade. Not because life becomes easier, but because you are no longer fragile. Freedom does not come from finally getting everything you want. Freedom comes from realizing how little you actually need it. When you desire less, people lose power over you. When people lose power over you, your mind becomes your own. And when your mind becomes your own, you rise into a state where emotional bruises no longer penetrate as deeply, where manipulation has nowhere to take root, where fear loses its vocabulary. This is the essence of becoming untouchable. Not unreachable, not unfeeling, just sovereign. A person who engages with the world fully, yet is owned by nothing within it. You are no longer controlled by the world, because you no longer need anything from it.